have to flip all the way back real quick. All right, so this is the first, these are all pictures that Emily took because she's an artist and I just like to swim in the ocean and snorkel. This is in the island of Milos. This is kind of a typical church. They were all pretty beautiful, a white with blue trim, and of course with the awesome blue ocean water there. And there was cliff jumping everywhere. They didn't always recommend you cliff jump everywhere, but I figured if you just jumped out from it, you'd clear the rocks, and typically I did. That was on Santorini. There you see the beautiful white cones and the blue water down below. And that's a sunrise we got to experience in Santorini. And there we are together watching the sunrise. How cute. And Emily brought her favorite figurine. His name is Stretch Armstrong. She got it originally for our little nephew Owen. And Owen loved it so much, Emily figured she might too, so she bought one for the trip. And after all of his modeling, at the end of the trip, as you can see, his onesie there was almost rubbed off from all the fun he's been having. And there we are at dinner, and just enjoying the beautiful sunset with a beautiful wife. We were able to watch sunset. We brought her little sister and her older sister and her older sister's husband, and so we were all able to just enjoy Greece together. And credit cards pay off eventually. I guess if you save enough points for 10 or 15 years, you can afford to go to Greece. So we were able to do this trip airfare-wise for free, which was pretty awesome. So thanks for just allowing us the grace to go. It's great to hit the pause button on life and get priorities settled and just to enjoy some rest. So thanks for allowing us to do that. I heard Harold did a great job, and I was back last week for Pam and Todd's awesome presentation of their mission trip to Honduras. And finally, I wanted to share with you one last thing. Emily and I have a sort of a big announcement for you guys. So Emily, if you wanted to head on in, and just want to share with you something neat. Maybe not the announcement you were expecting. What's her name, Millie?
B for short.
Yeah. She's our little German short-haired pointer. And she's got stage fright, I guess, a little bit. So we'll share her afterwards. But her name's Brigsby, and we're pretty excited. She's going to be a great little hunting pup. So if you hear some barking or whining back there, it's not Emily this time. Sorry, Em. If you have your Bibles, would you turn with me to the book of Nehemiah, chapter 2, and starting in verse 11. Nehemiah chapter 2, starting in verse 11. I want to share with you today 4 ingredients to rebuilding, 4 steps to restoring relationships in our life. And does it mean they're going to be restored by the time we're done with doing all 4 of these things? By no means. But there are 4 steps that we can take at least, and we'll see what God wants to do with that. So we're going to start today in chapter 2, verse 11. We've learned about this guy named Nehemiah who was sitting pretty in a place called Susa. Susa is in modern-day Iran, and it's 900 miles away from Jerusalem. The Israelites have been carried away from Jerusalem, and there are a couple of 1,000 people who've been carried from Babylon, and the king has allowed them to go back to Jerusalem. But do you remember what Jerusalem is like? What do we find out in chapter 1? Is Jerusalem in pretty good straits or pretty bad straits? Pretty bad. And the wall is broken down, and the gates have been burned with fire. And it says in Nehemiah chapter 1, when he hears about this, when his brothers come back from Jerusalem and tell Nehemiah, the dude's heartbroken. He instantly, it says, begins to cry, begins to pray for Jerusalem for 5 months. And as it says in Nehemiah chapter 1, it says, as soon as I heard these words, in verse 4, I sat down and wept and mourned for days, and I continued fasting and praying before the God of heaven. The dude's pretty heartbroken, because he knows that this group of people was intended to be in a relationship with God. And now they feel like they've been forgotten by him, like they've been kind of left in the dust. And so Nehemiah is called by God to go back to Jerusalem and restore the relationship with God. Everything in the Bible is really oriented towards that theme of restoring relationship with humanity back to God. And Nehemiah is a great example of that, how he restores the Jerusalem people's faith, the Jerusalemites' faith back to God. And ultimately, as we'll see today, it's Jesus who does that for us. In the very beginning in the Bible, remember in Genesis chapter 3 what happens when Adam and Eve eat that Brussels sprout? Which direction do they go? Do you remember? away from each other. And Adam does what? He hides. And when God comes and walks in the garden on that day, as he always did, do you remember what God said to Adam? Did he say, "What in the heck were you thinking, Adam? It sounds so darn ticked at you?" How God responded? His first words to Adam after his sin were what? "Adam, where are you?" They're words of relationship. God gets to the point, and he ends up saying, because this relationship is broken, I'm going to have to heal it by sacrificing 2 animals and covering you with their skins to atone for your sin. But the first issue in God's mind is not first sin, it is first a broken relationship. And so in order to fix that broken relationship, he covers our sins. And so when you look at the story of the Bible, it is God saying, "I've not given up on you yet. I'll never give up on you. I want to be in a restored relationship with you." And so that's what the book of Nehemiah and the grand scheme of it all is about. God's never given up, and he's never given up on us either. And so the first step we're going to learn today is we seek some different areas in our life to rebuild. The term I'm going to use, is the phrase I'm going to use, is take the trek. So Nehemiah goes a long ways to enter into the boots or into the chocolate sandals of the people in Jerusalem. He goes 900 miles and he walks 4 months to get there. You got to understand something about Susa. It was a pretty comfy place. Nehemiah was cupbearer to the king, which means he got to eat all of the red velvet cake before the king did. He got to drink all the best wine before the king did. He was one of the king's trusted men. And yet he hears this news about people who are cut off from God. And he says, "I want to make something right. I want to do what I can to restore the relationship to God, to make them feel like they've got some self-worth again." And so Nehemiah takes the trek and he goes 900 miles and he incarnates in their world. Look what it says in Nehemiah chapter 2, verse 11. "So I went to Jerusalem and was there how many days? 3 days. So I went to Jerusalem and was there 3 days." Nehemiah spends 3 days just getting to know the people, shooting the breeze, walking around in their sandals. Incarnate. Have you guys ever had a carne asada burrito? Or heard of a sarcophagus? It's the same root word that means flesh. So when Jesus came, it means that God put on skin and walked among us. And that's exactly what Nehemiah does here. He walks 900 miles, and he tries to get into the shoes of people who he came to help. And that's what I love about Nehemiah, is he does an awesome job of just being with them and calling their trouble his trouble, calling their pain his pain, and working with them to raise out of the ashes. So I want to ask today, how can we walk in the boots of a son or a daughter, a spouse, or an older person in the church? Can we take the trek to say, "I want to get to know you. I want to know you. I want you to feel like you've been seen. I want you to feel like you're known." One of the things I'm learning in my class right now, it's a counseling class that I'm in, is the importance of attachment. From the very youngest years of our life, how important it is to be attached. My professor went to some Romanian orphanages in the 1980s, late 1980s, and this is pretty well known, but in those Romanian orphanages, the caregivers did a great job of caring for their physical needs. They gave them the food they needed, they gave them the water they needed, they took care of their hygiene needs, but the caregivers never cared for their what? Their emotional needs. And so she said it's the craziest thing. You'd walk into a room full of 30 or 40 infants, and it was dead quiet. No babies would cry, no babies would make a sound, because they learned that no matter how much they cried, it didn't affect the fact that they're getting their meal at 8 a.m. and that they're going to have their diapers changed at 10 a.m. There was no personal interaction. So none of the babies actually felt or known. It's the importance of attachment. And so these babies, it turned out, didn't have any of their emotional needs met, which meant that they were distant from people as their life went on. What happens so often for us is that we can't take the trek. We can't take the trek in people's lives. So often for me, the hardest trek in my life, the longest trek, is the 20 feet from the couch to the kitchen table. Where I'm on the couch and my wife is at the kitchen table, and I should probably give an apology, but it's 20 feet where my pride is in the way, and my family heritage of avoiding confrontation is in the way, and so it's the longest trek in the world for me to go and say, "Hey, Em, I'm sorry." You guys ever been there? What scientists are learning is that there's a pretty simple reality that has a lot of grace tied up in it. And that is that if you 30% of the time, just 1/3 of the time, try to get into their boots, try to get into their shoes. If it's a spouse or a son or a daughter, and your son comes home from school one day and he's really in a bad mood, and you notice that he's angry, instead of responding with anger, like you see they're presenting sentiments, anger, so we respond in anger, or resentment, so we respond in resentment. If you actually think about the deeper reason why they're angry, you ask, hey, what happened today? Did anything go wrong? Why are you angry? Why are you upset? And we notice that. It then allows for a secure attachment to take place between our son and between us. So if we only did that 30% of the time, scientists say that's enough. That's great. If you're able to ask the deeper question and try to get into their shoes a little bit and get into their life, they say that will create a healthy connection between them. That's good news, because so often I fail to get into my wife's shoes. I don't ask the question about what's going on. The next part is, even when we fail to do that, 70% of the time, scientists say the rest is rupture and repair. It means I didn't do a good job of incarnating into her life and asking what was going on. So then there's this rupture that takes place. She says, I don't feel known. I feel like he doesn't get what's going on. So if I pick up on that and I say, okay, I see that she doesn't feel known, I can say, honey, I'm sorry. I should have incarnated. I should have got into your life a little bit more and asked what was going on. Will you forgive me? If I do that even 50% of the time, scientists say that's enough. That's a healthy relationship. If you can, that's a lot of grace, right? So if we enter into their shoes 30% of the time, and we get it wrong 70%, and then the other half of the time we say, hey, I'm sorry, I didn't totally get what was going on. Could you forgive me? That's the importance of attachment. And Nehemiah knows he's going to a people who feel forgotten. He's going to a people who feel left behind. And so he says, I want to take the trek and enter into their life. I want to incarnate with them. It's a science of attachment. So I want you to imagine for a moment as Nehemiah comes up. He says that he went to the king and he asked the king, hey, I want a lot of building materials to go back to Jerusalem and rebuild the gates that have been burned down, to rebuild the walls. And so the king says, you can go to the king's forest and get all the wood that you need. And I want you to imagine for a moment as Nehemiah shows up to Jerusalem. What do you see as Nehemiah shows up with all that wood, with all the building materials, and he rolls into town? If you're a Jerusalemite, what are you thinking? Who's willing to invest in this town? What is he doing here? And you see the dust coming up as all the chariots roll in with all the building materials, and Nehemiah hangs out with them for 3 days, and it says that Nehemiah actually lives in the walls of Jerusalem. And in chapter 7, verse 7, it says that nobody was living in Jerusalem. It was desolate. It was destroyed. But Nehemiah says, I'm going to call this place home. And I'm going to work out of the city center, out of Jerusalem. What a strange sight this would have been for all the people in Jerusalem. So these people felt forgotten. I wonder how many of us in this room have ever felt like that. God, where's the goodness we used to know? Where's the grace? Where's the forgiveness? I feel like it's not there anymore now. Isn't it cool that Nehemiah has actually been scheming for 8 months about how to rescue the Israelites? And the whole time the Israelites thought they'd been forgotten. So way back in November of this year, in Nehemiah's year, way back in November, he started praying. He said, God, I want to go and help these people out. I want to go and I want to make a difference. Would you just show me what I could do, how I could make a difference? So for 4 months he does that, and then he does a 4-month journey from Susa to Jerusalem. So for 8 months, this guy's been scheming on how to help the Jerusalemites. And the whole time they've been thinking God's forgotten about us. What I love about God, he's a God who always finds ways to bring his people back to him. That's what it says in 2 Samuel 14. He says, all of us, this is like Eeyore talking here. All of us must die eventually. Isn't that positive? Our lives are like water spilled out on the ground, which cannot be gathered up again. I love what it says here. God does not just sweep life away. Instead, he devises ways to bring us back when we have been separated from him. And I want you to imagine the people in Jerusalem. They felt like, no, we've messed up too much. The chasm between us and God is too big. We rejected him. He's not going to want us back. And Nehemiah comes with all this building materials, and he's like, no, God hasn't forgotten about you. The whole story of the Bible, the whole story of our lives is God trying to convince us that he wants to be in a relationship with us. And he'll send his son to die on the cross to cover that chasm of sin between us and between God, to prove it. And so the people in Jerusalem for the first time believe again that God wants to be in a relationship with them. So the first part, take the trek. I want you to think for a moment what it was like as Nehemiah was just hanging out in the city for those 3 days when he first showed up. What were people thinking? What's this guy doing from Susa, 900 miles away? Why is he here? He was walking in the Chaco sandals of the people in Jerusalem to get to know him before he made the building take place. It reminds me of Jesus. Jesus took the trek as well. It says in Philippians chapter 2, this is what Paul says about Jesus. It says, though he was God, Jesus didn't think of equality with God as something to cling to. Instead, he gave up his divine privileges. He took the humble position of a slave and was born as a human being. When he appeared in human form, he humbled himself in obedience to God and died a criminal's death on the cross. So Jesus made that huge trek from being king in heaven, from being royalty to being a slave on earth. Why? So that he could love us, so that he could bring us back into a relationship with God. And what was that going to take to do that? The cost wasn't cheap. He was going to have to die on the cross to cover those sins that were keeping us between us and God. So Jesus took that journey as well. So the first step as we restore relationships in our life is to ask the question, in our marriage, with our kids, in our workplaces, at our own church, how can we take the trek? How can we go and enter into the shoes, not just be somebody who consumes, but to be somebody who actually pours out our life to help in that area? The second is that we got to be able to do reconnaissance with rubble. To do reconnaissance with the rubble. So look with me what it says in Nehemiah chapter 2, verse 12. It says, then I arose in the night, and a few men with me, and I told no one what my God had put into my heart to do for Jerusalem. There was no animal with me, but the one on which I rode. It says, I went out by night, by which gate? By the valley gate, to the dragon spring, and to the dung gate, and I inspected the walls of Jerusalem that were broken down, and its gates that had been destroyed by fire. So he was living in the city walls. It says that he goes to the valley gate, he goes outside here, and he goes down to the dung gate. He's going to go all the way around to the fountain gate. He's going to come back up, and this is the Kidron Valley in here. He's going to go all the way up to the top of the wall and all the way back around on this night. He's doing recon on the rubble. It says that as he went around, went on to the fountain gate, into the king's pool in verse 14, but there was no room for the animal that was under me to pass because of the rubble. Then I went out in the night by the valley and inspected the wall. I turned back and entered by the valley gate, and so returned. And the officials didn't know where I had gone or what I was doing, and I had not yet told the Jews, the priests, the nobles, the officials, and the rest who were to do the work. So the second step as we restore or rebuild our relationships was we've got to do reconnaissance in the rubble. And that is the hardest thing in the world to do. Can you imagine Nehemiah? How hard was this hike around the city for him? Remember how he reacted way back in chapter 1 when he heard the news about the city? And now he's seen it with his own eyes. He sees how great this place used to be and where it's at now. And he's willing to do the hard work of walking around the city. That is the hardest work for us to do. It's hard to acknowledge the loss and the consequences of the loss. And how often in our lives do we run from the rubble, never acknowledging our pain? Have we done reconnaissance with the rubble of a marriage? Maybe we had a dream that's now shattered, and have we grieved over it? So often in our culture, we love to just run over grief, just to try to ignore it, to try to run past it and get through it as fast as we can. It was interesting as I was at a beautiful celebration of life yesterday to think about how we do funerals here in America. We wait a couple of weeks until we're strong enough to make it through. We show up in our best clothes so that people think we've got it together. And then we sit in rows and we listen to stories that people have planned out long ahead of time. And we sit sit under an order of service that gives us the best chance of staying whole and strong. And I just got to thinking, how come we don't ever deal with grief very well in our culture? We always try to run from it, and that's my problem. So often I just try to run from it. I'm learning that I have clinicalized, I don't think it's a word, but I'm going to call it a word, clinicalized the rubble of my dad. I try to avoid reconning the rubble by Christian platitudes. You know, God was just ready for him to come home, so it's okay. Or I try to cover it up with holy things like work or ice cream. And we can never rebuild until we've come to terms with what we've lost. We can never rebuild until we've done reconnaissance on the rubble of our lives. Have we come to terms? Have we mourned? Have we checked under the rug yet? It's not going to be easy, it's not going to be enjoyable, but we can't move forward until we've done reconnaissance on the rubble. Where's an area in our life that we seem to pass over, but man, it still hurts if we were to dig into it? That's one of the toughest things for me. I don't want to dig into it. I'm doing fine. I'm doing fine. You ever heard that before? Doing fine. Well, maybe if we slowed down long enough and did some introspection on our own hearts, God wants to do some awesome healing there. But we can't have the healing until we acknowledge the rubble that's there. The evidence of Christ's love for me is not only that he loved my dad enough to resurrect him, but also that he loves me enough to resurrect me from the rubble of his loss. But I first have to acknowledge the pain, the loss, the consequences of what's happened. And so my encouragement for us today is, have we done the recon? Have we looked through our heart and asked God, would you heal this? God, being honest with you, this sucks, this is hard, and I need you to take this from me. Where's the area in our life that we have yet to do recon? I see Jesus doing recon early in his ministry as well in John chapter 2. As soon as he starts his ministry, Jesus does something. He goes to a place similar to what Nehemiah did. Jesus goes to Jerusalem, and he goes to the temple, and he notices that the place is in ruins. There's some rubble. I said a couple of weeks ago that Jesus came to the earth, in a sense, one of his major goals was to make faith real again. Because when Jesus came to the earth, faith was not real for so many people. It wasn't possible to even live underneath all those laws. So Jesus goes up to the temple, and what does he see? This was him doing reconnaissance. It says it was nearly time for the Jewish Passover celebration, so Jesus went to Jerusalem. In the temple area, he saw merchants selling cattle, sheep, and doves for sacrifices. He also saw dealers at tables exchanging foreign money. Jesus made a whip from some ropes and chased them all out of the temple. Is that nice, soft submissive of Jesus? Jesus did what? He made a whip and chased the animals out of the temple. He drove out the sheep and cattle, scattered the money changers' coins over the floor, and turned over their tables. Then going over to the people who sold doves, he told them, "Get these things out of here! Stop turning my Father's house into a marketplace." Then his disciples remembered this prophecy from the Scriptures: passion for God's house will consume me. In the Hebrew, the word for passion there is a face that turns red. Can you ever see Jesus with that kind of a face? He's ticked. And sometimes doing recon on the rubble is hard, but we've got to acknowledge this isn't how God intended it to be. And so our heart breaks over what we see, whether it's a marriage or whether it's a family or whether it's a church. Our heart has to break before we can ever ask God to rebuild. And that's on God to do the rebuilding. What's on us is to do the recon. To say, God, this area is broken, this relationship is broken, this area of the church is broken, I need you to do the rebuilding. I can't do that. I'm going to ask that you would do it, but I'm just being honest before you, God, that this area of my life is broken. That's on us. So Jesus does recon as well, and it breaks his heart to see some of the things that are going on in Jerusalem in his days. Thirdly, the third step is that we would encourage the team. So many people in our families, whether it's a spouse or whether it's a coworker or people in our own church, we just need to be encouraged. Do we live in a very encouraging world? When you turn on the news, is it always encouraging things? When we have job reviews, is it always encouraging? And one of the biggest needs that we have as a people is to be encouraged. And I love how Nehemiah does this. What do you think that Nehemiah says after his night ride in verse 17? He says, all right, you see the trouble, and what's the word he uses there? You see the trouble you are in? You see the trouble, shout it out, verse 17. Then I said to them, you see the trouble we are in. Nehemiah, this guy who's been in town 3 days. Nehemiah, this guy who comes from comfortable Susa, he calls their trouble his own trouble. He says, you see the trouble we're in. Isn't that awesome? That's what Jesus does for us. He comes alongside us. And so often what happens is I can't see God very well across this pile of sin in my life. And I think, God, you don't want anything to do with me because of all this. And I don't realize that God actually is on this side of the pile of sin with me. And he deals with it one at a time with me. But so often we think, God, this is my sin. He says, no, Jesus actually took our sin on himself. He took our shame and our guilt and he laid it on his own shoulders so that we didn't have to deal with it on our own. And so Nehemiah does the same thing. He says, you see the troubles we are in. He takes it on his own shoulders. And then look what he does. He says how Jerusalem lies in ruins with the gates burned, Come, let us build the wall of Jerusalem, that we may no longer suffer derision. And I told them of the hand of my God that had been upon me for good, and also of the words the king had spoken to me. And they said, let's do it. Let's rise up and build. So they strengthened their hands for the good work. So Nehemiah does three things here to encourage his team. First, he shows up. That's the biggest thing we can do for people, whether it be a son or a daughter at a sports game, or whether that be a coworker. We got to show up and be with them. So often we feel like we're doing life alone. Nehemiah takes the trek and he shows up in Jerusalem. The second thing he does is their trouble becomes his trouble. He says, you see the trouble we're in. How cool is it when somebody says, hey, I'm right here with you. You're not alone. I've been there. That's empathy. He says, I'm going to be with you through all of this. And thirdly, Nehemiah reminds them whose they are. Nehemiah reminds them whose they are. I want you to see with me in chapter 1, verse 10. Nehemiah in his prayer says some pretty powerful words. He says, these, Nehemiah chapter 1, verse 10, are your servants and your people, whom you have redeemed by your great power and by your strong hand. Nehemiah, in his encouraging of his team, I can imagine him saying, you know what, guys? You've forgotten whose you are. You're God's people. And even though you make mistakes, do you see the entire history of God and his people? It's that he wants to be back in relationship with you. I love the scripture in Matthew chapter 3. Before Jesus has done any of his miracles, before he's attained salvation for the whole world, he's baptized, and how does God respond when he comes up out of the water? I will be so proud of you when you do those miracles. I will be accepting of you after you've earned salvation. Is that what God says? He says to Jesus, this is my dearly loved Son who brings me great joy. Brings me great joy? What's Jesus' profession been for the last 20 years of his life? A carpenter. He hasn't done any miracles. He hasn't done any of his huge works. He hasn't attained salvation. And yet God says, you're mine. And I love you. And I'm proud of you. And I'm stoked to be your pops. Isn't that cool that that's what Nehemiah does? And that's what I want to encourage us with too, that the first thing we got to understand is that we're actually God's son. And he's proud of us. And he loves us. And he's delighted in us. And so often I think, well, God will be delighted in me the moment I do the right thing. The moment I live out the goal that he has for me. So often I live my life thinking I'm the pastor of this church. And what I first need to realize is that I am God's son. And have you ever, I'm not a dad yet, but a dad who sees his son eating a meal, that his dad, with his finances or with his own rifle maybe, shot the deer, and now his son is eating that meal? Is that a pretty satisfying feeling for a pops? And so often, that's how I got to picture my Heavenly Father. That he looks at me enjoying life, just being a son, and he's excited. He's delighted in me. And Nehemiah encourages his people by saying, you know what, you're God's people, and that's never going to change. And he wants to restore you. And so how do they respond after all that? In verse 19 it says, or verse 18, they said, let us rise up and build. So they strengthened their hands for the good work. Isn't that awesome? Nehemiah encourages them, and they're ready to go. As a father, as a husband, as a wife, as a mom, as a grandparent, how can we be encouraging to people who need it? That's what Nehemiah does, and it makes all the difference for his people. So finally, in verses 19 and 20, the fourth key piece to restoring and rebuilding is that we fight discouragement with God's promises. Discouragement always comes, doesn't it? You ever notice that? You're getting ready to do something awesome, you believe God's for you, and then the fundage goes away. You do something awesome, and it seems like the door's shut in your face. You do something awesome, and somebody's there to say, well, it could have been even better if you did this. I've got a neighbor who comes over to our house regularly, and every time he comes over, he points out something negative on the property. And I'm pretty proud of the place. And every time he says, hey, did you notice that? You should fix that. Did you notice that? You should fix that. I'm just like, geez, I'm doing the best I can, man. And what's it like when you always have someone speaking in negativity and discouragement? And I love how Nehemiah responds. Look at what it says in verse 19. But when Sanballat the Horonite and Tobiah the Ammonite servant, and Geshem, those are awesome names, the Arab heard of it, they did what? They jeered at us and despised us and said, what are you guys doing? Are you rebelling against the king? And Nehemiah responds to discouragement with the promises of God. He says this, the God of heaven will make us prosper, And we, his servants, will arise and build, but you have no portion or right or heritage in Jerusalem. He's just like, get out of here. You have no room to speak in this place. And so he confronts the discouragement with the promises of God, and God says, I want to make you prosper. That's a promise that affects all of us today. It's a promise that is real today. He wants us to prosper in our lives, in our marriages, in our families. He wants us to prosper. He wants this church to prosper. And sometimes what happens is we think that prospering is going to happen today. It's going to happen right now. Or it's going to look like this, or it's going to look like that. And that's not always true. Was it easy for Nehemiah to rebuild the wall? Did he need a team? In chapter 3 next week, you can read ahead of time, he gets a huge team of people to rebuild this wall. It's a tough task. He has people who are perfume makers rebuilding the wall. He has people who are goldsmiths. He has people who sing on the choir team rebuilding the wall. They're all working together as a team. It's not going to be easy for God's prospering to take place. There's a huge role for us in that. But he promises us that he wants to see those things prosper. And I love what it says in Romans chapter 8, verses 10 and 11. And Christ lives within you, so even though your body will die because of sin, the Spirit gives you life because you've been made right with God. The Spirit of God who raised Jesus from the dead lives in you. And just as God raised Christ Jesus from the dead, he will give life to your mortal bodies by the same Spirit living within you. And it's so easy for me to get discouraged. Think, God, you must have given up on your dream for me. God, you must have given up on this relationship in my life. And God says, don't you know that the Spirit of him who raised Jesus from the dead dwells in you, Isaac? Never given up on you. And we got to counter the discouragement in our lives with the promises of God. That he wants us to prosper, that he's with us, and he'll never leave us. And that's the awesome promise that God gives us. I see Jesus trusting the promises of God as well, and we'll close with this. In John chapter 11, Jesus shows up at a funeral. What happens every time Jesus shows up at a funeral? He ruins it, right? So he shows up at Lazarus' funeral, and Mary comes in, and Mary's sick, and she said, Lord, if you would have been here, my brother wouldn't have died. Would that have been a pretty discouraging moment for Mary? How about Jesus? Jesus loved Lazarus. He was one of his best friends. You see Jesus' heart in that moment? I could have saved his life. If only I'd been here a little earlier. And Jesus, in that moment, instead of being discouraged, he says something. He names a promise. He claims a promise of who he is. He says to Mary, I am the resurrection and the life. Whoever believes in me, though he die, yet shall he live. And sometimes we forget that that's how powerful our God is. That that's how much he loves us. That he died on the cross to give us that new life. And maybe some of us have become discouraged today. We've been told by Sanballat that there's no hope for our marriage. We've been told by Tobias that our dream is dead and there's no resurrecting it. And darn Geshem has us convinced that God just can't bring joy back to us. So ultimately, the story is about God restoring a relationship with his people, and he sent Jesus to prove that. It's the climax of the entire story of God. Jesus came to restore relationship with us. Are you walking in that awesome family of God? Are you a part of that awesome family? Have you said, Jesus, would you bring me back to the family of God? I want to be there with you. Jesus came, he died on the cross, and he buried our sins so that we have that awesome opportunity today. Would you pray with me? Jesus, thanks for sacrificing everything so that we might be a part of your family again. Jesus, I'm in awe as I look through your word, and over again, it's God never given up on us. So God, help me as I so easily become discouraged. Help us as we so easily become discouraged to remember that your Spirit lives in us. And that's the Spirit that raised the guy from the dead. Jesus, you love us so much. I pray that you would lead us this week to trust you. Father, I pray that you would lead us to be a people this week that bring your good news, that bring your good word to those who are discouraged. Help us, like Nehemiah, to take the trek into the broken relationships of our lives. Thank you, Jesus, for being the ultimate model for us. We pray these things in your name. Amen.